Remember that the Cornell Notes has everything that is typed on the slide. But as you can see, that is not the only information that you need in order to do well on the exam. Make sure that you're taking notes as we go through these lecture videos, and make sure that you're reviewing your notes. Okay, because remember, AP is not just straight, easy peasy multiple choice memorization. Okay, it's more than just vocab terms. You actually have to use them for historical analysis. Okay, so we've talked about England before under the Tudor Dynasty, and that was primarily a religious conflict that we covered. Now we're going to move over to religious and political conflicts. Okay, so the two factors that we see combating during this time is the political conflict over constitutionalism and absolutism. Now we know what absolutism is. It's when there's one guy in charge, the king, and what gave him the right to be in charge, to hold all that power. The divine right of kings. Exactly. So God put the king in charge, so he answers only to God, and he holds all of the power, like what we saw with Louis XIV in France under the Bourbon Dynasty. Okay? Constitutionalism is a contrast to that. Constitutionalism is a representative form of government. One person does not hold all the cards. Power is shared. And in England, there was a long, long history of constitutional rule. So they had a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute monarchy. Okay, this dates all the way back to the Magna Carta in 1215, when King John was forced by the nobles to sign the Magna Carta, establishing some basic rights for the population. Then Parliament was created in 1265 to rule in tandem with the monarch, okay, making laws. Okay, so power becomes shared between branches of government, the king and Parliament. So England, for about 500 years prior to the Stuart Dynasty, had a long heritage of constitutional rule. And the last dynasty that had ruled England had been mostly constitutional and mostly Protestant. Okay, y'all remember Henry VIII. He was the one that broke the English away from the Catholic Church. Then his son, Edward VI, is super Protestant. Then Henry's daughter, Mary I, she's super Catholic. Okay, so Protestant, Protestant, Catholic, and then Elizabeth, who rules the longest, is Protestant. Okay, so mostly Protestant dynasty that ruled with Parliament under constitutionalism. Well, who was supposed to take over after the Tudor line died? That would be the Stuart line, first with Mary of Scots. But before she could inherit the throne, Elizabeth had executed her for treason, which was a big blow to the divine right of kings. Therefore, it undermined absolutism. Now, Scotland was an absolute Catholic monarchy. Okay, so you're going to see absolutism and Catholicism go together, like with Louis XIV. Okay, the church and the state work together to maintain the status quo. So when Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed, who's supposed to take over after Elizabeth? Well, Mary had a son, James Stuart, and he becomes James I of England. But like his mama, he is Catholic, and before he ruled England, he had inherited the throne to Scotland when his mother died. Okay, and so he's going to be Catholic, and he's going to be used to ruling absolutely. That's going to start the foundation for the English Civil War, that political battle. In terms of the religious conflict, you have the age-old conflict that's been going on for over a century. Protestants versus Catholics. The king wanted absolutism. Parliament wanted constitutionalism. The king wanted Catholicism. Parliament wanted Protestantism. Okay, so there's a religious and political conflict. with the Stuart Dynasty taking the throne in England. Now, the Stuart Dynasty was not the only absolute Catholic monarchy. They ruled Scotland, but you also have the Bourbon Dynasty in France. Think Louis XIV, the quintessential example of what it means to be an absolute monarch, and the Habsburg Dynasty in Spain. Now, the Habsburg Dynasty had controlled the Holy Roman Empire until the Holy Roman Empire decentralized after the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So what we're going to see here is a trend of the power of absolutism decreasing and the power of constitutionalism increasing, especially as the Enlightenment begins. And those Enlightenment ideals by philosophers like John Locke start claiming that absolute government is not the best government. We need representative government. The people have a right to have a voice in the government. They have natural rights like life, liberty, and property. Okay, and we're going to go all in on the Enlightenment in the next PowerPoint. Okay, but this is a trend. Constitutionalism and representative government increases, absolutism decreases. Are we good so far? Now, before the rise of constitutionalism, the word on the street was that absolutist monarchies were the way to go. Jean Bodin, who we've talked about before, was one of the first to support the divine right of kings as a thesis for the best form of society. Okay? He said that we need a strong absolute monarch. If we don't have a strong government, then we don't have laws, and society collapses into pandemonium and anarchy and chaos. We need a government to enforce the laws, and that government needs to be strong, or else no one's going to listen. If there's no consequences for breaking the laws and no one to enforce them, then people aren't going to follow the rules, and society is going to get crazy. Okay? So we need a strong absolute monarch to maintain peace and stability through law and order. Absolutism is the best form of that government. And absolutism uses divine right of kings. Now, would his thesis be proven right or wrong by the French Revolution? Well, with the French Revolution, it starts when they get rid of their king. They execute their absolute monarch, Louis XVI. And following that, the French Revolution goes through a reign of terror. Now, does that sound good or bad? That sounds pretty bad. That's like, yeah, I'd prefer to skip the reign of terror if that's okay. Okay, so once the king is gone, another basically dictator comes to power, Maximilien Robespierre. And he is going to guillotine, he is going to behead all of his enemies and anyone that he suspects of being his enemy. So thousands of Frenchmen and women are going to be beheaded under this reign of terror. Okay, so things got really chaotic after the execution of the absolute monarch, Louis XVI. Okay, so this would support Bodin's claim. If you get rid of the absolute monarch, then society goes crazy. That's what we saw in the reign of terror. So this would be evidence supporting his thesis, the French Revolution and the reign of terror and the rise of Napoleon. Okay, we're going to see that support for absolutism is going to slowly decline during this time period, and representative government is going to become much more popular. Okay, now, Scotland was absolute and it was Catholic. So when James comes to claim his throne in England after Elizabeth dies, he is going to be in conflict with Parliament, because Parliament said, hey, we're constitutional and we're Protestant. And James says, hey, Scotland is absolute and Catholic. I'm James VI of Scotland and James I of England. I want to rule England like I've ruled Scotland. Okay, so just like when we saw Charles I and Charles V, they were the same person. Charles I of Spain was Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire in the Habsburg Dynasty. Same thing happens with James. He was king of Scotland before he inherited England. He was the 6th guy named James to rule Scotland, so he's James VI. He was the 1st James to rule England, so he's James I. We're going to refer to him as James I to make it easier, okay, because we're talking about England. Are we good so far? So Tudor Dynasty is out. The Stuart Dynasty is in. This family tree is in your Cornell notes, and I also have it posted in the lecture series, but it's important because it's not that you need to know who ruled when and for how long, okay, but you do need to know the order in which they ruled and the events that led to each one of these people coming to power. So I've numbered who ruled first. So I'm not going to quiz you on what years did James I rule, and you have to know 1603 to 1625. Like, no, okay, that's just basic memorization. You don't need to know that. But you do need to know that it was James I, then Charles I, then Charles II, then James II, and then we have the Glorious Revolution. So how I keep track of that is I think of a sandwich, which I'm usually thinking of sandwiches, but this time it's actually useful. Think of James as the bread and Charles's as whatever you put in your sandwich: cheese, tomatoes, bacon, whatever. So it goes James, Charles, Charles, James. First, second, second. Okay, so that's how I keep them in order, because it's important for you to get these numerals right, because James the first is very different from James the second. Charles the first is very different from Charles the second. One of them gets beheaded. One of them commits treason. Okay, so think of a James and Charles sandwich. So how did we get from the Tudor line to the Stuart line? Well, Henry VII, who was Henry VIII's daddy, had Henry VIII as his son and Margaret as his daughter. Now, this is Margaret Tudor. This is not the same Margaret from France. This is not Margaret Valois. Okay, different Margaret. So Henry VIII had a bunch of wives, and he had 3 children. The last of whom survived him was Elizabeth I. Elizabeth is the last of the Tudor line. So now we need to trace back her next closest living relative. Well, Henry VIII's sister, Margaret, had married the King of Scotland, James IV. They had a son, James V. James V had a daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. This was Elizabeth's cousin, but we know that Mary of Scots never got to rule because she was executed for treason in 1588. Thus, her son, James, comes to rule Scotland. So he's James VI. When Elizabeth dies, there's no one left in the family tree in the Tudor dynasty, so they move over to the Stuart dynasty with James. So James I inherits the throne. Now, he's used to being Catholic, he's used to ruling absolutely, and so him and Parliament don't get along very well, okay? When James I dies and his son Charles takes over, they're not going to get along very well. Charles, like his daddy, believes that he should have 100% of the power. And so he commits treason trying to get that power. He tries to get another country to invade England and take out Parliament. So he starts working with Catholic Spain. He's like, hey, I'm Catholic. I want to rule like y'all want to rule, because the Habsburgs were absolute monarchs. It's like, how about we make England Catholic again? You send me money and ships and an army, and we'll get rid of Parliament, and then I'll be in charge. Well, Parliament finds out, and they are not too happy with this. And so they're going to charge him with treason, like his grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots. And also like his grandmother, they're going to have him executed for treason. Now, what effect does this have on the divine right of kings theory? Does this strengthen or weaken the divine right of kings? It weakens it, okay? Is this going to be the last king who gets beheaded for treason? No, In France, years later, Louis XVI will be executed, starting the French Revolution. So this is the English Civil War. Okay, Charles II is beheaded, and that ends the Stuart line for now. His sons, Charles and James, flee the country because their dad just got beheaded. They don't want to be next. So they go into exile. So who's going to run England if there's no king? Well, Parliament says we're no longer a monarchy. We're going to establish a commonwealth. And one of our Puritan parliamentarian leaders is going to be the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth. And that Lord Protector is Oliver Cromwell. Now, he is a Puritan. Now, remember that Puritans are English Calvinists. Have we seen a government with Calvinists in charge? Yeah, in Switzerland under John Calvin. Remember that they were a theocracy, okay? They ruled through religion. Secular laws and religious laws were one and the same. Okay, so the government and the religion were one and the same. So yeah, you have the normal secular laws against murder and stealing and all of that stuff, but you also have religious laws that are put in place under Oliver Cromwell, like laws against drinking and dancing and gambling and whistling. Okay, so England becomes very not fun for a very long time under Oliver Cromwell. Okay, this period of time when he rules England and there's no king is called the Interregnum, the time between kings. Now, once Oliver Cromwell dies, his son was supposed to take over the position of Lord Protector. But by that time, England was tired of Puritanism. And so they tell Oliver Cromwell's son, you need to get out of town because we're not going to let you rule. And then if they don't have a Lord Protector, who do they have ruling England? Well, this is when they mail Charles II. That must have been a really interesting letter, right? Hey, how are you? How's your dad? Oh, wait, yeah, I killed him. By the way, so we kind of have an opening for King of England, and we'd really like you to strongly consider this position. Would you mind coming back and being king? Okay, now you'd think, you know, if someone killed your dad for ruling England as an absolute ruler, then maybe you wouldn't want to take that position. But Charles II learned from his dad's mistake and was like, okay, I will come back and be king. This is called the Restoration. The restoration of the Stuart Dynasty. Oliver Cromwell is out, and we're back to having a monarchy, but it's a monarch that rules with Parliament. And Charles II is going to be pretty chill. He's going to open up the dancing halls, open up the bars and the pubs, and no more Puritan rule. Okay, but Charles II doesn't have any children with his wife. The only child he has is an illegitimate child that cannot inherit the throne. So when Charles II dies, okay, the throne doesn't go to his sisters, it goes to his brother, James II. Okay, so James II isn't like Charles II at all. He's a lot more like his granddaddy and his daddy. He believes, like James and Charles I, that he should rule with absolute power. So Parliament is ticked off by this again. And they're like, oh, Lord, this Stuart Dynasty, we got one good king out of all of them so far. What do we do about James II? Well, they don't want to kill him again because it didn't go so well when they killed Charles I. And so they decide, well, we don't want to get rid of a monarchy. We just want to get rid of this specific monarch. What if the next person in line took over? And so they message his daughter, Mary, who had gotten married to her cousin, the King of Netherlands, William of Orange. And they Parliament sends them a letter saying, hey, if you raised an army and invaded England and overthrew your dad, we would totally be cool with it. XOXO. So they're basically committing treason. But remember, it's only treason if you get caught. Charles I If he had been successful in invading England with his Catholic forces, then there would be no parliament to charge him with treason. But he got caught, and therefore he died. Parliament didn't get caught. They were successful. William and Mary were like, bet, we're going to be right there with our army. And they raised an army and invaded England in the Glorious Revolution, also known as the Bloodless Revolution, because it wasn't like Parliament was raising an army to fight William and Mary. They wanted them to come in and take over. So James II flees England and he goes into exile. He tries to raise an army to come back and take his throne, but he's never successful at doing so. So they don't kill James II, they just kick him out. And so, well, now that he's exiled, William and Mary take over as joint rulers, king and queen, and they rule with Parliament. However, they have no children. So when they die, their next closest living relative is Mary's sister, Anne. So Anne becomes Queen Anne, but she also has no heirs. The Stuart dynasty is over when Anne dies with no children. So that means they have to go through the family line to find the next closest living relative. That moves us over to the Hanover Dynasty. Okay, the first king of whom is going to be George the First. So he takes over with the Hanover Dynasty after Queen Anne dies. Then we get George II. Then we get George III. George III is actually the king who's in charge of England when the American Revolution happens. Okay, so that King George. Then we have King George IV. And eventually we get Queen Victoria of England, whose children are going to rule almost all of Europe. Like every monarch is going to be related to her in some way. Okay, which means a lot of power, but it also means a lot of genetic abnormalities like hemophilia that gets passed down through the royal lineage because of all the inbreeding. Okay, so it's important to remember how we got from the Tudor dynasty to the Stuart dynasty, the order of the Stuart dynasty: James, Charles, Charles, James, William and Mary, Anne, and then the Hanover dynasty. And all of these events, like the English Civil War, the Restoration, and the Glorious Revolution, that happened during the Stuart dynasty. Are we good so far? All right. So how did this Civil War begin? Well, the Stuart monarchy wanted to be Catholic and absolute. Parliament wanted to be Protestant and constitutional. Okay, now remember, England had a long history of constitutional rule. So it wasn't like they were being unreasonable. Okay, James came in and they were like, hey, this is how we do things. We do things differently. And James the First said, actually, no, I want to do what I want. Okay, so under constitutionalism in England, we have a long history of checks and balancing, basically checking other branches before they wreck themselves. Okay, this theory of checks and balances in government was theorized by Baron de Montesquieu. You need to know his name. Okay, he's one of your vocabulary terms. Now you can refer to him by just Montesquieu. It's kind of like Erasmus. We don't really need to know his first name. So if you see Montesquieu, that's who it's referring to. And his theory said that the best government rules in cooperation with its branches, but these branches can check the power of the other branches so that no one branch and no one person becomes too powerful. And y'all, this is going to be a key element of our form of government, okay? The idea that we should make sure that no one branch rules over the others. So like in your shaping our curriculum assignment, it has lessons on the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. In our federal government, our national government, the executive branch is the president, the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, and the legislative branch is Congress. But we also have those branches on the state level, like the executive branch is the governor. The Alabama state legislature is the legislative branch. The judges are the judicial branch. And then on the city level, the mayor is the executive branch. Okay, so we have a lot of branches in checks and balances in our government. So how does this work? Well, there's currently a COVID relief package that's working its way through the government right now. All right. A part of these checks and balances means that certain powers are separated amongst the branches. So it's not like the president can just make whatever laws they want to make. Okay, there's a system. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws, and the judicial branch interprets the constitutionality of the laws. So with this COVID relief bill, first it has to go through the House of Representatives, and that's based on population. So we have 7 representatives in the House. So the COVID package has passed the House, now it's going to the Senate. Now there's only 100 senators because each state gets 2 senators each. So we have 7 representatives and 2 state senators. Okay, once the bill passes the Senate, then it goes to the president. So it goes out of the legislative branch into the executive branch. Okay, now the president can sign the law and it becomes law, but he could check the power of the legislative branch. And if he disagrees with a law or a bill, he can veto it. That's one of the powers that the executive branch has to counter the legislative. So how does the legislative counter that? Well, once that bill is vetoed, it goes back to Congress. And Congress has to vote on the law again, but they have to pass it with more than just a simple majority of like 50. They have to pass it with a 2/3 majority, so 60. They can override the veto of the executive branch. When it comes to the Supreme Court, the president nominates people for the Supreme Court, but the legislative branch, Congress, confirms those nominations to the Supreme Court. Okay, so we see those checks and balances throughout government, making sure that the different branches have to work together and making sure that no one branch of government can rule over the country by itself. Now, in England, that was through the monarch and parliament ruling together. Okay, England had a parliament dating back to 1265. Scotland didn't have a parliament. So when James I came in, he was like, yeah, no, I don't need parliament. I'm just going to do my thing. So when his heir, Charles I, came to power, Parliament was like, yeah, no, we've got to rein this guy in. So they passed the Petition of Right in 1628, limiting the power of the king. They said you can't make your own taxes. You can't charge taxes and get revenue from it. You can't imprison people unless they break a law. And you can't force people to house soldiers without the house owner's permission. Okay, that's what quartering soldiers means. It means the king says you have to have people live in your house that you don't know because they're his soldiers, and you have to feed them and supply for them. Okay, so this power of the purse is the most important power that they tried to take from the king. They tried to control the finances of the government, saying the king can't make taxes on the people. Only Parliament can levy taxes on the people. So trying to limit him economically. Now, Charles I is forced to sign it, but he ends up ignoring it anyway. He tries to levy taxes. He tries to raise money. He tries to get someone to invade England, which is going to result in him losing his head when he's charged with treason, thus starting the English Civil War and the Interregnum, the time between kings. Charles II is going to be like, okay, I want to be king, and in order to do that, I have to be chill. I have to not tick off Parliament. I have to not be an absolute monarch. And he's okay with that. His brother, James II, not so much. Are we good so far? All right, so to see this basically on a timeline, Elizabeth dies, the Stuart line begins. James I rules, he's not well liked. Charles I rules, he's disliked so much that he's beheaded for treason. This starts the English Civil War, also known as the Interregnum, or the time between kings, from 1649 to 1660. They didn't have a king, but they did have a Lord Protector. Okay, so the divine right theory, it's on its way out. Charles I is not going to be the last monarch of Europe to be executed under treason. Louis XVI, years later in France, is going to face the same fate. So this is Oliver Cromwell. He establishes a theocratic commonwealth that is Puritan. England eventually gets tired of it, so they invite Charles I's son to come rule, and he's super chill. That's the restoration of the monarchy. His brother is not as chill, and so that starts the Glorious Revolution. When William and Mary invade, Mary becomes Mary II, William becomes William III of England, and Parliament is going to increase its power. They do this through the Act of Settlement. In 1701. Okay, so the Glorious Revolution took a year. Okay, this isn't how long William and Mary ruled. They ruled for longer than that. It's just the whole war setting up this new government took time. So the Act of Settlement in 1701 made it illegal for a Catholic to inherit the throne. Parliament's like, we can't do this whole Catholic king thing. William and Mary were Protestant because even though Mary was the daughter of James II, she married the Protestant king of the Netherlands. So she converted to Protestantism. And so Parliament said, we're not doing Catholicism anymore. It's Protestant or bust. We're going to make it illegal for Catholics to inherit the throne. Now, if this Act of Settlement had been in force when Elizabeth I died, then the Tudor Dynasty never would have ruled England. Okay, they would have searched and searched for a Protestant heir who superseded the Catholic claim. Okay, so from now on, you have to be Anglican or at the very least Protestant if you're going to rule over England, because they don't want a repeat of the religious struggles and the political struggles that they had with Catholic monarchs being in charge. Parliament's also going to pass the English Bill of Rights, which again is going to increase representative government. It's similar to our Bill of Rights, giving the people more power and more protection from the government. Okay, so absolutism and Catholicism in England is silenced by Parliament. Parliament ends up winning out in the English Civil War. Are we good so far? Now, this chart is also in the lecture series on Schoology. And again, it just goes through the sequence of events. You have the James Charles sandwich, James Charles Charles James. First is James, then is Charles I. He is beheaded, which leads to the English Civil War, the Interregnum, the time between kings. Oliver Cromwell becomes the Lord Protector and establishes England as a commonwealth. Eventually, people get tired, and so they restore the Tudor Dynasty to rule in the Restoration. Charles II was chill. James II, not so much. So Parliament has him thrown out in favor of his daughter and her husband ruling, Mary II and William III of Orange. They rule for a long time, but, well, not really a long time, but for a few years, but they die without any children. So the next closest relative is Mary's sister, who becomes Queen Anne I. When Queen Anne dies without any children, that ends the Stuart Dynasty and starts the Hanover Dynasty, which is the dynasty that's going to be in charge of England during the American Revolution with King George III. Are we good so far? So we know that absolutism is decreasing in Europe during this time, and that's due to Enlightenment ideals. That's an N. Enlightenment ideals. Okay, these are ideas that said maybe people aren't terrible. Maybe people have certain rights. One of the philosophers from the Enlightenment was John Locke. And he came up with the idea of natural rights that every human has. And these natural rights are life, liberty, and property. I know y'all are probably more familiar with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but that's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson comes years later, but he's influenced by John Locke's ideas. Okay, when Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, John Locke is long dead, but his ideas from the Enlightenment have spread. So Thomas Jefferson takes the ideas of life, liberty, and property and changes them to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Okay, now John Locke says the government cannot take these rights. Well, slavery would say otherwise. Okay, the Portuguese government instituted the slavery in Africa, okay, the Asiento. Okay, so as the Enlightenment ideals spread throughout Europe and start the English Civil War and the French Revolution, you're also going to see it spread in European colonies in the New World. And the people in the New World are going to say, hey, wait a minute. Y'all believe in life, liberty, and property for every human. That includes us. Okay, so this is going to start revolution. Okay, former enslaved peoples in the Caribbean and in the colonies are going to fight in order to gain their freedom based on these Enlightenment ideals. Okay, one illustrative example of this is in Jamaica with the Maroon Wars. Maroons were former slaves who had escaped from the colonies and lived outside of the colonies in settlements. Okay, so groups of escaped peoples had formed communities outside of the European colonies in the New World. Well, eventually they became large enough and powerful enough to overthrow the colonizers. Okay, so Queen Nanny was the leader of the Jamaican Maroons. She led them to victory in overthrowing the European colonizers and making Jamaica an independent country. Okay, so she is a national hero. Here she is depicted on Jamaican currency. Now, this is not the only successful slave revolt that occurred in the Americas. Haiti is going to be a slave-led revolt that results in independence in the nation of Haiti from France. Okay, the American Revolution, right? The Mexican independence movement, okay, the South American, Latin American independence movements, all of these are going to be traced back to the Enlightenment ideals that began in Europe, saying you can't just apply it to Europeans, you have to apply it to everybody, okay? And slavery does not mesh with Enlightenment ideals. So in addition to seeing the decline of absolutism, we're also going to see the decline of slavery. All right, so the first part of this slide is the social contract theory. What is that and who came up with it? Well, Jean-Jacques Rousseau came up with the idea that humans have entered into a contract with the government. And a contract is a promise. There are obligations on both sides of that contract. Okay, this is an agreement where people give up some of their rights. Okay, laws are created by the government and they're enforced by the government. And we have laws against murder and stealing and all of those bad things. So if we live in a natural state or the state of nature with no government and no rules, then the strongest people have all the power, which is not a great form of government for people like me, okay, because I would be robbed immediately. I'm very, very frail, okay? And so as a society, we have agreed that we need laws and regulations. The government makes those laws and regulations and enforces those laws and regulations. And in exchange, we give up our right to take and steal and murder. Okay, so we give up some of our rights in exchange for a promise from the government that they will give us a peaceful and stable society by enforcing law and order. Okay, so Rousseau doesn't say anything about what's the best form of government. He simply explains that this is how we came to have government. We entered into an agreement with the government to follow its rules. The people who argue what type of government we should or should not have are Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Now, Thomas Hobbes comes first. He is going to write a book called The Leviathan. And the Leviathan is a biblical creature that's very big and very strong. And he uses this as a metaphor to explain what government should be. Government should be powerful and it should be big. So the type of government that he claims is the ideal government for a peaceful society is absolutism. Okay, he believes in absolute rule. Now, if he believes in absolute rule, that means he must also believe in divine right theory. Because remember, what gave the kings the right to rule absolutely? God did. Now, why is he so pro-strong government? Well, he believes that the government has to be strong because people in their natural state suck. People are terrible. They will fight and kill and steal and murder and all of those things if they don't have laws reining them in. Okay, if we don't have a government and we just exist in a state of nature, then our life will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, which refers to fighting, and short. So we will not live very long in a society without government. We will be living in a state of anarchy, which is a fancy word for chaos or pandemonium. Okay, and so in order to prevent chaos, we need a government that is strong enough to control us because we are terrible. We need a government to protect ourselves from ourselves and to protect us from other people. And the absolute government is the best government to do that. Okay, so he is pro-big government, he is pro-absolute rule, he is pro-divine right, because people suck. Don't write that in your essay, though. Okay, you gotta make it AP. John Locke is going to be a foil to Thomas Hobbes' argument, meaning he is going to argue the opposite of Hobbes. Okay, John Locke was a philosopher during the Enlightenment. All right, a philosopher during the Enlightenment is known as a philosophe. He was one of the most important philosophers of the Enlightenment. He wrote the 2 treatises of government, and he claimed the opposite of the Leviathan. He said government shouldn't be big and strong because it might become too strong. And then who's going to protect us from the government? He also has a more optimistic view of humans. Whereas Thomas Hobbes says people suck, they're terrible, John Locke says, actually, people are just results of their experiences. Everyone is born with a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Okay, that's Latin for blank slate. Ancient Greeks and Romans, when they wanted to write something down, they would have a slate with wax on it. They would carve into the wax to practice. Whenever they wanted a blank slate, they could just melt the wax and start over. So John Locke is saying when we're born as babies, we don't know how to read, we don't know how to write, we don't know how to walk. We have to learn how to do all those things. And so if we have to learn to do those things, then it makes sense that we also learn how to behave and learn a moral code based on how we are raised. Okay, so if you want to make people good, then you've got to educate them. And you have to give them the opportunities to learn that code of morality. And so he believed that people were good, or they could be good, and that they should be in charge of the government. Absolute rule is too strong of a government, and that type of government would become tyrannical and might hurt the people. And so we need to rein in the government. We need to control it. So he is pro-representative government, constitutional monarchies, democracies. He says that that's the best form of government, that the people should be in charge. So whereas Thomas Hobbes believed in the divine right theory, where the king has the right to rule, John Locke believed in the natural right theory. He said that every human, no matter your social class or race, you are born with natural rights. You don't have to earn them, you just simply already have them. And those natural rights are life, liberty, and property. Y'all may be familiar with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That's from Thomas Jefferson. He wrote about the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness long after John Locke was dead. But guess where he got the idea? He got it from John Locke. Now, it wasn't like John Locke was writing to Thomas Jefferson. He was already dead. But Thomas Jefferson read his works. He read his 2 treatises of government. And so when the American Revolution occurred, Declaration of Independence was issued, Thomas Jefferson changed natural rights to inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. John Locke's original rights were life, liberty, and property. And if the government infringes or violates any of those rights, if they start killing people or imprisoning people without cause or taking people's stuff, then John Locke says we have one more right. We have the right to rebel against a government that does not protect these natural rights, because he says that's the whole job of the government. That's why we entered into this social contract in the first place. We as a society decided that we were going to have a government with laws and rules for the purpose of protecting these 3 main rights. So we have the right to life, liberty, property, and the right to rebel. Now, does Thomas Hobbes say we have the right to rebel? No. Under the divine right theory, God put the king in power. You shouldn't rebel against the king, and you shouldn't rebel against God. So under Thomas Hobbes' theory, okay, for absolutism, you don't get to rebel, even if times are bad or even if the king sucks. He says the government's in charge, and that's that. John Locke says we actually do have the right to rebel. So this is similar like in the Mandate of Heaven in China. In the Mandate of Heaven, if things are going well, then that means the dynasty is favored by the gods and you keep them in charge. If things are going poorly, like there's famine or war or disease, then you have the right to overthrow the dynasty. Okay, so this is similar to what we see in the Mandate of Heaven. If the government isn't doing its job, then you get to overthrow it, because you have to keep the government from becoming too strong and becoming a danger to the people. Now, why is this idea so important? Because in period 3, from the 1750s until 1900, it is going to be a key catalyst, a key cause to a number of independence movements, a number of revolutions. The American Revolution, clearly there's influence from the philosophes of the Enlightenment, because Thomas Jefferson directly gets his ideas from John Locke. They fought against what they considered a tyrannical government under King George III of the Hanover Dynasty over the issue of representation in Parliament. Okay. The French Revolution is going to overthrow the absolute rule of the Bourbon Dynasty with the beheading of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Okay, they figured they had the right to rebel. The Latin American countries are going to overthrow their colonizers. Mexico gets independence. Brazil gets independence. Okay, all of these countries in the New World are going to become their own countries. They no longer have mother countries that they report to. Also, slavery doesn't really mesh really well with the natural right of liberty. Okay, this is not going to be just a European phenomenon. It's going to spread beyond Europe. All right, so if every person is born with these rights, okay, and slavery takes away your rights to life and liberty, okay, then that means that these slaves have the right to revolt, to rebel. And so we're going to see a series of slave revolts occur in the New World. The Maroon Wars in Jamaica are going to be led by Queen Nanny to overthrow the colonizers. Haiti is going to go through an independence movement and become its own independent nation that outlaws slavery. Okay, so in addition to the decline of absolutism and religion, we're also going to see a decline of slavery following into period 3, as we see the rise of representative government and the rise of revolutions. Are we good so far? Excellent. So now we're going to do a little bit of practice with the historical thinking skill of comparison. So give me a second to move my screens around. Zoom share. Can y'all see the whiteboard? Okay, open the chat. So when we compare and contrast, one of the best visuals to do this is the use of a Venn diagram. Okay, two overlapping circles with similarities represented in the center and differences where they don't overlap. So over here, I'm going to put John Locke, and over here, I'm going to put Thomas Hobbes. And then we're going to fill in this chart together. So tell me in the chat or verbally, what are some similarities or differences between these two important thinkers? They both believed a government is necessary. Government is necessary. What is that theory called? Social contract theory, which Jean-Jacques Rousseau extrapolated on. All right, someone in the chat said Hobbes is pro-absolute rule, so absolutism. Okay, if Locke is the opposite of Hobbes for his belief systems, if Hobbes was pro-absolutism as the best form of government, then what did Locke say was the best form of government? Yeah, democratic or representative, sometimes in a constitutional monarchy. So representative government. Now, one of the key factors of absolutism is what gives the kings to rule, the right to rule absolutely. Okay, so what is that theory that allows kings to rule with 100% power? The divine right of kings. John Locke didn't believe in divine right. What kind of rights did he believe in? Natural rights. Good. Which were life, liberty, and property. And if the government infringed upon those rights, you also had the right to rebel. Excellent. Do you have the right to rebel under absolutism? No, you do not. No rebellion allowed. Now, why did Hobbes believe that we needed a strong government? What was his reasoning behind it? People are naturally bad, to protect people from each other. Locke had the opposite idea of we needed a restricted government. And people are naturally bad, but instead they have a clean slate, a tabula rasa, that their experiences write upon to form their moral code and their personality. Okay, excellent. Y'all are doing great. So absolutism relies on divine right theory. There's no rebellion allowed. You need a strong government because people are naturally bad. And if you don't have a strong government, then anarchy results, chaos. Locke believed in representative government with natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And it was the job of the government to protect those rights. And if the government failed in that job, then we have the right to rebel. Okay, so we need to restrict the government because humans aren't naturally bad. We have a tabula rasa. So do they have more similarities or more differences? If you were to argue, exactly, more differences. If you tried to make the argument that Hobbes and Locke have a lot of similarities, you wouldn't have a lot of evidence to back that up. You could say, yeah, they both believed in the social contract theory and they were both English or they were both male, but that's not a lot of evidence, okay? It would make more sense for your thesis to say, Hobbes and Locke, while they shared the idea of the social contract theory being in play in society, differed over ideas of what government was the best government and why that government was the best, and what rights people had under that government. So it'd make a lot more sense for you to argue differences as opposed to similarities in this particular example of comparison. We good so far?